So in my humble opinion, certainly every form of exercise or most forms of exercise are very beneficial. Doing something is always better than doing nothing for your health. But if I were to pick one activity that is indispensable, it would be resistance training. And there's a couple of reasons. So certainly cardiovascular exercise, it's been much more well researched over the years, and indisputably it has great effects on your health and wellness. But resistance training has many of the same benefits as cardiovascular exercise, but it goes well beyond what you can get through aerobic training, and particularly dealing with muscle strength, obviously, and bone density, and other things like posture. So aerobic exercise itself has very minimal effects on your strength levels, on muscle development, on muscle hypertrophy, even on bone development. So certainly running has certain benefits to bone, but nothing in the way that resistance training does. And again, things like your posture, people don't even consider if you are sedentary and not doing anything, over time, you're going to lose muscle, your posture is going to go, and you can do all the aerobic training you want. It's really not going to have these benefits.
So that you just mentioned two things that I was unaware of, in the bone density and the posture. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Resistance training affecting bone density, because
Yeah,
that
sure.
seems very relevant for particularly post-menopausal women.
It is. So osteoporosis, which is basically porous bones, it's when over time, the aging process, your bones, if you are sedentary in particular, will start to degrade. And the 80% of people with osteoporosis are women, because women generally, number one, start out with less bone mass. There's also effects of, as you mentioned, estrogen is osteoprotective. So when women undergo menopause, postmenopausally, they're going to have increased bone resorption, which is going to increase their chances of getting osteoporosis. And resistance training, by pulling on the bones, muscle pulling on the bones. So there's an interaction. Your musculoskeletal system is the muscle that allows, when you have movement, it's the muscle pulling on the bones to move. And strength training really is the primary way to strengthen the bones. So while you're strengthening the muscles, necessarily the bones become strengthened as well. Then there's certain ways that are going to be more appropriate than others to maximize that process. But really, no matter what type of resistance training you do, whether it's light loads, heavy loads, etc., you're going to be strengthening bones. And it's always, by the way, specific to the joint that you're working. So it's weight-bearing exercise in particular is what strengthens bones. If you're doing cycling or even the elliptical machine, it's really not weight-bearing enough to have substantial effects on bone development. And swimming, another endeavor. Whereas running, to some extent, there is ground reaction forces, but it's mostly specific to the femur, to your lower body musculature, whereas the spine and the wrist is going to be a major area for osteoporosis, particularly in women. Anyway, long story short is that resistance training, when done regularly and consistently over time, has profound effects on staving off the potential for osteoporosis and even building bones, particularly when you're younger.
You said there are certain types of exercises that may, be better, or is there any types of exercises that you can talk about? I mean,
yeah, so it seems so. Most of the research has been using somewhat moderate to heavier loading. I'm not convinced, though. I think it's an effect that we just don't have research that's really looked at doing lighter load training with bone density. And I would surmise, if you are training with a good deal of effort, high levels of intensity of effort, that you would achieve similar effects. But it also does seem that doing more multi-joint movements, so multi-joint meaning like squats, movements that are utilizing more than one joint. Multi-joint is more than one joint. So rather than a curl, you can get better effects overall on bone because of the loading that is imposed. So again, not really great evidence. This is more speculative based upon the literature I've seen. I'm a fan of any type of resistance training over not. But if you're looking to maximize bone development, I would certainly say you want to include some multi-joint movements. And I think just in general, there's other reasons why you'd want to as well.
Besides the squats, what are some other like
rows, presses,
okay.
Push-ups, any type of movement where you're involving more than one joint.
For someone that doesn't, like someone that's working with dumbbells, for example, who's not going to go use a machine, can you do multi-joint movements with dumbbells?
Shoulder press,
okay.
chest press. Dumbbells are great, sure. Okay. Shoulder press, chest press. You can do squats. You can do a goblet squat where you hold the dumbbell here and do a squat. So yeah.
Well, that was I didn't realize, I mean, I had a question there about bone density, but I didn't realize that it really does play a significant role in the bone density. And it's really
so this is an area that I've done pretty much so I've changed my opinion on so many things that, that I had learned as an up and coming sports scientist, and that were treated as dogma, in textbooks, that my views have, in certain respects, done 180, and nothing can be characterized more so than loading. So I had always thought that if you're doing anything over 12 to 15 repetitions, it's basically glorified cardio, and that, it's just muscle endurance. You're not going to gain muscle. The literature is now compellingly shown. There's so much literature on the topic. Our lab has done quite a bit of research, as well as many others. And it shows that you can gain similar amounts of muscle, regardless of the loading, across a wide range of loading spectrums, up to 30 to even 40 repetitions, which is a long set. And that's at the whole muscle level. Now, there may be, and I want to really emphasize, this is still equivocal. There may be some muscle fiber type specific benefits to doing light loads for type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers for heavy loads. If you're asking me my confidence in that literature, it's modest at best, but I can't rule out that would be the case. But when you're looking, let's say, at MRI data or ultrasound, which we've used extensively, really shows no difference. And I'll tell you what I think is a quite funny story looking back. But Stu Phillips had published a study circa 2012, and he went on social media, it was Facebook at the time, and it was on untrained subjects doing leg extensions. And it showed that there was no difference in whole muscle hypertrophy between 30% 1RM, which is like 30 reps, versus 80% 1RM, which was like 8 reps. And I remember it as clear as day, saying, "Still, come on, this is untrained subjects doing leg extensions. They get jacked from doing spin cycling." That was, I think, my exact quote. And I said, "I'm going to do this study in trained individuals. You're going to see there's going to be no question the older individuals are going to need the heavier loads to get those highest threshold motor units, the type 2 fibers, into play." And lo and behold, I carried out that study and no difference. It was really ate crow. And since then, there's just been so much evidence, not only just across the spectrum of populations, untrained, trained, older, younger, men, women, really any and every population has been extensively studied. And it really is a beautiful thing because it provides so much flexibility and options to carry out resistance training. And it's particularly, I think, beneficial for issues like training through injuries. So if you're training through injuries, heavy loading can be contraindicated. And also particularly for the older individuals, because joint-related issues, as you know, as people get older, they get osteoarthritis and other joint-related issues where heavy loading can be very uncomfortable for them and perhaps debilitating. And so it's kind of contraindicated. And they can use lighter loads. Now, the caveat to this is that the lighter loads have to be taken with a high degree of effort. So they have to really, if you do not extensively challenge your muscles, meaning that the last few reps are difficult to complete, you're not going to achieve gains. So when I talk about light loads, it's not this, taking pink dumbbells and just, doing some lifting. Okay, I stop. you must challenge the muscle. So when you lift heavier, just innately you're going to challenge the muscles regardless, because the weight is already heavy. With lighter loads, the first number of repetitions are very easy to complete, and if it's easy to complete, you're really not doing much for challenging. And this goes back to a survival mechanism. So the reason that the body, I think this is important, because the reason that the body adapts to strength training is survival. The reason that the body adapts to anything is through a survival mechanism. And if you are not challenging it in a way it is not accustomed to being challenged, it has no impetus to adapt. So the reason that you will get these adaptations in strength and power and hypertrophy, muscle endurance, bone density, et cetera, is because the muscles and bones, et cetera, tendons, ligaments are being challenged beyond their present capacity.
And so as you get stronger, then you have to push past that and challenge them more. So the big take home for lifting lighter, which is what I tend to do, is to get fatigued, right, when you're doing it. And so it often means more reps, which I enjoy doing. I've done both, and I do find for me, I like doing the lighter lifting and more reps versus doing heavier and fewer reps. And I also notice I'm less likely to injure my wrist if I'm doing now. Maybe that wouldn't, if I was doing things like proper form and all that, maybe it wouldn't be such an issue. But you mentioned the muscle type 1 and type 2 fibers, and maybe there's some evidence that lifting a little heavier might help shift a little bit more type 2. Can you talk just for a moment, like what are the roles of those types of fibers, and should people aim to kind of gain both of those, or are there distinct differences, in terms of with aging, their roles in aging?
Yeah. So great questions. So I'll tackle the second question first. So yes, aging is mostly specific. So when I say aging, what's called sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle, is most specific to the type 2 fibers, which are your strength-related fibers. So just to kind of even circle back, for those who don't know, type 1 fibers are endurance-oriented fibers. They do not produce force as well as type 2 fibers, but they're indefatigable. They can go on for longer periods of time. They're hard to fatigue. Whereas your type 2 fibers fatigue relatively easily, but they have the capacity to produce greater force. As you age, the type 1 fibers are more well preserved, where the type 2 fibers, there's even what's called apoptosis, which has been shown there's a loss of fibers, but certainly there's a diminishment where the fibers get smaller and smaller. It's more specific. The sarcopenic effect is more specific to the type 2 fibers, which is obviously problematic, because the ability to produce force is where your primary functional capacity, at least from being able to open cans and jars, avoiding falls, etc. Circling back, so then the training effect, I want to emphasize, you're going to train, if you are training hard, regardless of heavy, light, you're going to be targeting both 1 and 2 fibers. So we're talking now nuance. So if you're I think this is where this kind of gets lost in context, that where I think this would have the greatest, if it is in fact true, greatest relevance would be to, let's say, bodybuilders who want to maximize their muscle development. It probably is beneficial to utilize some heavier training and some lighter training, so that you at least make sure you're kind of hedging your bets and make sure that you're maximizing development of all fibers. For the average individual, if you are training hard, regardless of light or heavy, you're going to be getting type 1 and type 2 fiber development. And it's been well documented that light load training does target the type 2 fibers, that was one of the myths. It used to be taught when I was an up-and-coming sports scientist, that if you just used light loads, you would not activate the highest threshold motor units, which are associated with these type 2 fibers. And thus you would not optimize your strength and power and hypertrophy.
So we were talking about the resistance training, we've mentioned strength training, and then there's power training. And I think this probably has a little bit to do with what you just mentioned with the problem with aging, right? And so can you just briefly talk about differences, and maybe where, like, does one shine more than the other, with respect to like what older individuals should be doing or focusing on, or is it like, or women versus men? Is there any differences there as
Sure.
well?
So the definitions do somewhat vary depending upon who you ask. I'll give you mine. So resistance training is kind of a catch-all for any type of exercise that moves against resistance. This would be body weight exercise, push-ups, pull-ups, body weight squats would be resistance exercise. Free weights, machines, cables, any of these would be considered resistance exercise. Strength training often is used synonymously with resistance training, but also it can be thought of as specific to, let's say, powerlifting, where you're moving very heavy loads, and necessarily when you're lifting heavy loads, you're moving them very slowly. You can't, if I give you a very heavy load to lift, you can't move that fast, or you'd be able to do more than whatever you're doing. You'd be able to do more repetitions than what you're doing. Whereas power is the ability to produce force over time, so more quickly. The more rapidly you can produce force, the more power you generate. Power is developed on a foundation of strength, but it also involves this time component. And there is evidence that at least some training needs to be done, quote unquote, explosively. So moving weights quickly, or when I say weights, doing resistance quickly, to generate maximal power. And our group was involved recently in a meta-analysis on older individuals that showed functional improvements were optimized when they did training that involved moving the concentric action quickly and then doing a controlled eccentric. So I do think it's important for older individuals to incorporate some power training in their programs. It doesn't mean that every set needs to be done in this respect, but at least having some of the training that will be devoted towards power training. And I think it's really exemplified by the fact that hip fractures. So when older individuals fall, and it's a frequent thing now, particularly in those who are sedentary, they are not able to quickly reverse their fall and avoid the resultant effect of a hip fracture. And studies show that older individuals, when they get a hip fracture, it's been a while since I've looked at the literature. I think it was 50% never recover full function and die within, I think, 2 years. Half of them go into convalescence. They have to be under constant care. They're not able to be functionally independent. So, I mean, it's a big thing. Whereas a younger individual, they can get their cast signed by their friends or whatever, and it's not a big deal. But older individuals, these are really important issues that you want to stave off. And I would say that having some power training, and then again, other types of training. This is another thing I think is really important. We often think in binary terms, train this way, not that way, or, there's programs that are devoted, this is how you should train. We should be thinking of training as combining different concepts to a given goal, because often doing some lighter load training with some heavier load training, if possible. Sometimes that's not possible, but sometimes it is. Doing, like I said, some power training with heavier load training, or lighter load, moderate training. These are things that ultimately can optimize the effects for a given goal.
For thinking about the power training for me, I would think, well, sounds like it would be easier if I had lighter weights. Is that still considered power training if they're, or does it have to be like a heavier, like a fast movement with a heavier?
No. Again, you're not going to be able to move heavy and lighter relative terms. So if you're using a very let's say you're doing what's called a 3RM, the maximum amount of weight you can lift 3 times. Let's say I'm doing a bench press with a 3RM. Even on my first rep, if I try to move it fast, I'm not going to be able to, because the load, if I could, I'd be able to do more than 3 reps with that. So you're going to have to choose a weight that is relatively light. Let's say you're able to do a minimum of 10 repetitions or 10 repetitions. So again, light exists on the spectrum. 8 is lighter than 3. 3 reps is heavier than 8 reps. 8 reps would be heavier than 15 reps. 15 reps. So at what point is that, that optimal effect? There's no research that indicates that at this point, where you're But you're not going to be able to use heavy. It'll be above, let's say, 8. I'd say you'd have to go a minimum, as light as a minimum of 8 repetitions, 8 RM. If you could do more, if you could do a heavier load, you're not going to be able to move it quickly enough to get that benefit. And by the way, there's other things you could do. You can do plyometric training. Now, for some older people, that can be somewhat dangerous. But I mean, you can throw a medicine ball. That's a way of power training. So take a medicine ball. I mean, older people can easily do that. Where for the upper body, these are good upper body movements that would be, I think, very user friendly for people that are older. It can be fun, which again, it's kind of, we do see kind of this trajectory from youth to getting into our adulthood and then aging, where making it fun again a lot of times is important for older people.
What about, so you mentioned with the lifting lighter and, you know, the important thing of basically fatiguing yourself, right? Like you can't just do a couple and it's like, you know, compare that to lifting heavier and doing a couple, right? This whole idea of training till failure, and what does that mean? Do we need to train till failure? Is that important?
Yeah, so failure, for an operational definition, would be the inability to perform another repetition with proper form. And we carried out a meta-analysis recently on this topic. And the bottom line is that, and that's kind of the go hard or go home philosophy. You know, that's the bodybuilding mentality of go hard or go home. Every set needs to be taken to failure. The evidence does not indicate that's the case. So certainly you need to train with a high amount of effort. But to take certainly to take every set to failure is not only is it not, doesn't show any benefit for hypertrophy, it actually showed a small detriment for strength. So with strength, stopping a couple reps short of failure seemed to have better effects on maximizing strength than training to failure. Again, there are some limitations to that research. How much of that does that mean that if you train to failure, you won't maximize your strength? I'm not necessarily on board with that, but that is what our results showed. I also would not dismiss the fact that for very high level, let's say you're very close to your genetic ceiling, that it might make the need to go to failure, at least on some of the sets, more relevant, beneficial. We don't have this is purely speculative on my end, but I can see at least a logical rationale where it makes your challenge, it's a way to challenge the body in a way that it is not used to. I will tell you that when I coach bodybuilders, I generally incorporate some failure training, but another area where my view has shifted, maybe not 180, but probably 90 degrees, where I used to be the go hard, go home dude who every set need to be taken to failure. And now most sets within 2 to 3 reps of failure. So there's a concept called the repetitions in reserve. And a 0, it's the RIR scale, repetitions in reserve. An RIR of 0 means you're at failure, means you cannot have done another rep. There's 0 reps left before you go to failure. An RIR of 1 would mean that you could have done one more rep, and at that rep you would be at failure. From the literature, although we don't have a definitive way of making estimates on this, but my own interpretation of the literature is somewhere between probably 1 to 3 RIR, reps from failure, would be needed to promote optimal adaptations. You can still see adaptations, particularly when you're more in the newbie stage, in the early stages, below that. But 1 to 3, I think, is a good general recommendation that's necessary to see adaptations. Again, then you start getting into the weeds, getting into the nuances. For the Gen Pop, I probably would say that's always going to be effective, and you probably never have to go to failure for the goals of most Gen Pops. For bodybuilders, high-level athletes, perhaps some failure training, the last set to failure on some of your exercises at least. And again, you want to get into the weeds, probably using your single joint and machine-based exercises would be more appropriate for failure, let's say, than squats. So a biceps curl, a lateral raise, a leg extension. They're going to be, first of all, there's less issue of injury, because when you're going to failure, let's say in a squat, and if you've ever squatted, and you're in the hole and you're trying to push out, there's a greater potential for injury. Certainly you're going to need a spotter in that regard. or else you could be stuck and you can have problems. Or a bench press where you're trying to do that rep. If you don't have a spotter, that bar is stuck to your chest. Whereas if you're doing, let's say, dumbbell curls or lateral raises, at the very least, you're not going to be really torched after your sets. You're going to be able to come back strong. So these are just general, it's speculative on my part, but I think there's good logical rationale behind these things. And I do want to say that an evidence-based approach, so I do want to promote, one of the things my biggest hobby horse in life is to promote the importance of evidence-based practice. It is not simply deferring to research. Research is never going to tell you what to do, or virtually never. It's going to provide general guidelines, particularly in the applied sciences like exercise and nutrition. It will get you into the ballpark, give you general strategies to use. You then need to take this to the individual. What are their genetics? What is their lifestyle, their stress level, their sleep, their nutritional status, all of these things together. And then, of course, goals are going to enter into it. So developing a program from the research means to understand the research and then to use your own expertise in combination with the goals and abilities of the individual.
Right. With the designing the training program sort of aspect, we're kind of, sort of talking about this and, the training till failure, it sounds like that's pretty clear for me. Like, maybe the bodybuilders, that's a little bit more important. But for most people, getting within 1 to 3 reps until failure kind of answers you get a lot of questions about how many reps do I need to do? How many reps do I need to do? It sounds like it depends on the person. And when you start to feel that fatigue, when you're getting close, right? Like, so that's kind of what I'm thinking for myself. Resting between those reps or between the sets, or which way is it? The resting intervals,
between sets.
It's between the sets. So, so basically when you're getting ready to do another set, like how many sets do you need to do, or how long do you have to rest between them? Is that important?
Yeah. So again, it's on a spectrum and it depends on, so when I talk to my students, they'll ask me questions and I say, pretty much any applied question you're going to ask me, I will answer with an it depends, because within broad spectrums, you can gain. If you're doing a very minimalist routine, you can make gains. So if you're saying, is it important? It starts to become more and more important, the more important it is to you to maximize your results. If your goal is just to build some muscle, gain some strength, a very minimalist routine, training an hour a week, let's say 2 days, 2 half-hour sessions a week can give you most people, very nice results, provided you're training hard. Is that going to, if you're looking to be a bodybuilder, or you're going to step on stage? No, I would say with 100% confidence, that is not going to be sufficient to optimize your gains. So volume has been shown to be a driver of hypertrophy. Again, we've done original research on this. We've done made analytic work. And there is a dose-response relationship up to a certain point. It is individual specific as well. So some people respond better to, or respond well to lower volumes. Some people need more volume to maximize their results. Hard to study individual responses, but these are kind of general insights that we glean from the literature. But I would say, as a general guideline, to optimize hypertrophy, you want to be somewhere between 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week. Now, that's not going to be able to be done doing 2 half-hour sessions per week. But we recently published a review paper called No Time to Lift. It's open access. You can maybe post on this podcast the link to that, or show the image of the study. But we basically kind of looked at what is your minimal effective dose. And that was roughly around 4 sets per week, per muscle per week, which again can be done maximum 3 half-hour sessions, 2 to 3 half-hour sessions per week. You can get very nice results. And I think get probably, for most people, the majority of gains in that period of time. And then if you want more, you're going to have to devote more time.